Well, it actually happened at a time where, the entire world seems to have, realized for the most part that the whole lockdown ideology, was a false idol, that none of this worked. And, at the very least, even if they're not loosening their restrictions, nobody's going to be putting on tougher restrictions right now on people. Much of the world, people have been living under house arrest essentially for a year. So what much more could people on this planet tolerate? I would think even if everywhere is not going to become like Florida overnight, you would at least see a decline in the popularity of these measures and a gradual relaxation of restrictions. Even places like California here in the United States are going to, loosen things up a bit. Even in a place like California, they recognize that, this isn't going too well, and even if we're not going to admit we were wrong, we're at least going to give people some of their freedoms back by June. But just a bit further north, in Canada, things are as bad as ever, and in fact are getting worse. I thought that Quebec was the worst province in Canada. There was that story from last week about that the situation where the Montreal police rounded up a bunch of Rebel News journalists for wanting to report about an anti-lockdown protest. Of course, I've been watching Viva Fry's channel, and he lives in Montreal, and seeing, how they can't leave their homes after 8 p.m. There's a curfew in Quebec. You're not allowed to leave your house after 8 p.m. because that will spread the virus. So everyone has to be home and in bed by dark. And so I've, thought of Francois Legault as, he's the real big bad boogeyman up there. Well, old Doug Ford, brother of crack addict Rob Ford, who died a few years ago, has just topped Francois Legault, it would seem, by instituting the most draconian police state in, the developed world since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that is no exaggeration. I think that it is actually safe to say that, at least in the officially stated policy of the Ontario provincial government, is more oppressive and tyrannical than even that of the German Democratic Republic of Erich Honecker. I would actually think that the closest analog to Doug Ford's Ontario would have been apartheid South Africa. Of course, he is even far more draconian than the Boers who once ran South Africa ever were, because back when the Boers were in charge, apartheid was enforced on a racial basis, or I should say a tribal basis, not so much a racial basis. Zulus were supposed to stay in KwaZulu, and if they left KwaZulu to go to, either one of the unincorporated parts of South Africa where the white people lived, or another Bantustan, like Transkei or Ciskei or one of those, they had to have papers in order. And they had to have essentially an internal passport that showed where they were going and why they were going there, and any police officer could stop them along their way and demand to see their papers and make sure that their passes were in order. And if their pass was not in order, and if they didn't have a good reason to be traveling along the route that they were traveling, they were arrested. That was the crux of the horrible, apartheid policy that, all of the do-gooders in the Western world, in places like Canada and Europe and the United States, were so opposed to. Well, let's compare the policy of apartheid in South Africa to what Doug Ford is instituting up in Canada. In Canada, only, a very few select group of essential workers are allowed to, leave their homes to go to work. Non-essential workers appear to only be allowed to leave their homes for the purpose of, shopping at essential businesses, like I guess perhaps buying winter clothing although the winter months are ending, so the people are going to have less excuse to do that. Going to the grocery store and whatnot. But you can't just leave your house willy-nilly. You can't go outside just because you want to get some fresh air, because you want to go for a jog. Recreation appears to be almost completely banned. You apparently are allowed to gather with members of your own household outside of your home, like on your own property, but it does not appear that you're allowed to gather anywhere else. You're certainly not allowed to gather in another person's home. That is, unless you live alone, then you are allowed to go to someone else's house, but you're only one person from outside of the household is allowed to visit another household. And the police in Ontario now have the authority to stop any person who's out and about, or oot and a boot, as they would say up there, and demand to see their papers. And if they refuse, or if their papers are not in order, essentially, if they don't have a good excuse, a good explanation to be embarking on the route that they are on, if they can't explain to the police sufficiently why they are outside of their house, well, then they're going to be arrested. And so this is essentially apartheid, but it's apartheid instead of trying to keep apart different tribal groups, of which there were, several in South Africa, but 9 or 10 different tribal groups. Now, this apartheid in Ontario is trying to keep apart every single human being who's from a different household. So how many millions of households are there in Ontario? And so this is far beyond apartheid on steroids. This is, apartheid to an untold power. It's it's some exponential iteration of apartheid. People are kept so far apart that the freedom of movement has been completely eliminated in Ontario. There is zero freedom of movement. If a police officer can demand that you state your business just because you walked outside your front door, you're under house arrest. Okay? There's nothing left there. If you live in Ontario, you're a prisoner. The Western world used to say that citizens of communist countries were lived in giant prisons. Ronald Reagan used to refer to the Warsaw Pact nations as captive nations, captives of the Soviet Union, and their citizens, were like prisoners. The dictators of the various non-Soviet communist states who were members of the Warsaw Pact were like wardens, over those Soviet prisons. But the West has no moral authority to say things like that anymore, ever again, to anyone, after what's going on in Ontario, and probably in parts of Europe, I would think, too, although I don't follow Europe that closely. But I'm sure that if Canada's this bad, Europe has to be equally as bad, or worse in many cases. Doug Ford is now a more tyrannical leader than pretty much anyone that I can think of that the U.S. has ever sought to overthrow. I guess maybe short of Adolf Hitler. Maybe he hasn't gone that far because he's not murdering people that we know of, who go against his law. But I guess at least the majority of Germans in Nazi Germany were allowed to leave their homes and walk around freely, and go to the park and have a picnic. So in some respects, Doug Ford is a little more tyrannical than Hitler. But thankfully, the Canadians have not resorted to the tactic of death camps yet. I don't think that there are enough lockdown rebels to justify them having to execute them. I think that their prisons still have room left, before they're full. But comparing Doug Ford to Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi or Mullah Omar, I mean, there's no comparison. Doug Ford is by far the worst, just based on this. Bashar Assad, of course. All these guys, are they good guys? No. Would I consider them tyrants? Yeah, I would, all of them. If I lived under them, I would think of them as, my tyrannical overlord. But hell, if I was living under Saddam Hussein in 1995 or something, I'd think to myself, you know what? At least I'm not living under Doug Ford. At least I'm allowed to, go outside and stretch my legs and go for a walk in the park just because I feel like it. Hell, if you lived in Baghdad back in 1995, I would think there were some pretty nice places to go out and have have dinner or have a drink with your friends. you know, these Middle Eastern dictatorships that the United States was, so gung ho on overthrowing in the name of, restoring liberty and democracy and freedom. Actually sound pretty idyllic in comparison to modern Canada. And so I have to say, if we were willing as Americans to go all the way over to the Middle East to overthrow Saddam Hussein or to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, almost to overthrow Assad, I would think, gee, I mean, Doug Ford is right there up in Ontario. Justin Trudeau is there too. Francois Legault. All these guys, way worse than those Middle Eastern dictators. Why have we not already drawn up the battle plans to invade Canada? George W. Bush may have been wrong in 2003 when he said that the Iraqis would welcome us as liberators. But you know what? Many Canadians may very well welcome us as liberators because what they're dealing with is very serious. It's very hard to get out of Canada, and especially if you want to come back, they make it very difficult. That's how they're deterring people from leaving Canada, is they're making it very, very difficult to get back into Canada. People who leave Canada and come back are forcibly detained by the police for 2 weeks at their own expense. They have to pay a hotel bill, someplace that the police pick for them, and they're not allowed to tell their families where they are, communicate with the outside world. They're essentially put in solitary confinement, and one woman we know of at least was sexually assaulted, which is it's really hurtful to think about, but this is the reality of what Canada has become. And so, people don't really want to leave unless you're leaving for good. But, I think Viva Fry's onto something when he says, how long before they start, or before they pass an exit tax to force people to stay? Maybe start charging people capital gains for selling their primary residence to deter people from selling their homes and moving out of Canada. I mean, it really is a frightening contrast to think about how lucky I am to have been born in Florida. And I've been saying that a lot over this past year because, these people in Ontario, I mean, they're not that different from me. I can relate to them. I could see myself having grown up there and then all of a sudden find myself in this situation where I'm under house arrest by this tyrannical brother of a drug addict who, died and I guess of a heart attack. I don't know, maybe that was drug related. And then you contrast what's going on in Ontario with what's going on here in Florida, and we're getting to the point here where we're getting so far back to normal that I normally only wear masks in chain stores where they supposedly require it or whatever. But there's so few people at Walmart these days who actually wear a mask. I feel uncomfortable, complying anymore. So we're pretty much a normal society here in Florida. Whereas up in Canada, you have this insane police state where they think, where the government's acting like that this is the apocalypse and that the hospitals are being overrun. We're hearing that again. Well, I guess maybe, Canadian socialized medicine is notoriously inefficient. So I guess it's possible that their hospitals are being overrun, but even if that's the case, we know that putting people under house arrest is not going to make them healthy. I guess maybe the theory is, if we put people under house arrest, suicides will spike to such an extent that there will be less people in the province in general who may potentially be in need of hospitalization. Maybe this is seen as sort of a culling of the weak. Maybe with all this going on, these Canadians, if they want to flee to the United States, I hope that they go to one of these left-wing states like New York or California, because these people have, they're going to definitely, you're even a Canadian conservative, so-called, is much closer to an American Democrat than an American Republican, and the Democrats here in the United States are getting to the point where they're being forced essentially by the facts and by reality to have to open up their states to a certain extent, to a point that I think that a lot of these Canadians who might be off-put by Doug Ford's apartheid regime, they might feel a little more comfortable with Cuomo's New York or Newsom's California, as bad as those places are as far as I'm concerned. But I mean, they might think to themselves, oh, gee, we got to go to Florida because Florida's free. No, you Canadians don't actually like freedom. I don't know, maybe some of you do. I shouldn't say that. There are some Canadians that like freedom, but the vast majority of you obviously do not. Your culture is well to the left of even the rotten and corrupt American culture. So while I pity and sympathize with you and your current situation, I still do not want you here. You're not welcome in this state unless you really have, kind of come full circle and you're thinking in a little bit different terms. If you're the kind of person who would not vote for, Rob Ford or any of the other people up there in Canada who think that they're all crazy tyrants, well, then maybe you would fit in here a little better. But we in Florida don't need any Canadians coming down here and voting to elect the original Orange Man, Charlie Crist, to be our governor for a third term. Oh, and by the way, to all the Canadians who have always scoffed at the right to bear arms here in the United States, I bet a lot of you might be reconsidering that now and thinking, gee, if only we Canadians had some recourse for standing up against a tyrannical government. I mean, really, if there's anyone who doubts the necessity of the Second Amendment's role in deterring tyranny, just look to the North in Canada. They're quite similar to us. A lot of times, if you get a Canadian and an American in the same room, it might be hard to tell which is which. But in situations like this, you see that their government is able to is able to push the envelope a lot further than ours did. Even the worst states are much better than Doug Ford's Ontario. And remember, Doug Ford is not a lefty. Doug Ford is supposed to be a conservative, I believe. He's no Maxime Bernier, but old Max is not a mainstream politician anymore. He's not even a member of the Conservative Party. He had to go off and start his own just to be, an actual, center. I would call Bernier center right. He's not, he's nowhere near where I am. Yeah, so the seeds for this were sown a long time ago. I mean, it's not surprising. It's not an accident, I should say, that this is happening in Canada and not the United States. I do feel for the people living under this, as I keep saying, but when you have such a blue-pilled national culture, really, I think being blue-pilled is a part of the Canadian national identity. It should not come as a shock to see things like this unfold. So with that said, I think I'll leave things off here for today.